In the warm June air of Mumbai, inside a quiet Juhu apartment, a tragedy unfolded that would soon grip an entire nation. A rising star was found lifeless, and within minutes, the police declared it suicide. But nothing about that night was simple. Not the scene, not the timeline, not the evidence, and certainly not the unanswered questions that refused to die. As cameras gathered outside and headlines exploded across India, a darkened narrative began to surface, one filled with emotional turmoil, shocking messages, unexplainable marks, missing footage, and a grieving mother convinced that this was not suicide, but something far more sinister. For the next decade, investigators, forensic experts, lawyers, and journalists would clash over one haunting question. Was this a young woman's final desperate act, or the perfect crime hidden behind a story of suicide? Tonight, we dive deep into the inconsistencies, the missing links, and the shadows surrounding the death of Jiah Khan. A case where every answer seems to open a new mystery. The night was supposed to be ordinary, but inside the dimly lit corridors of Sago Sanjit apartments in Juhu, something was already brewing. Something tense, something silent, something that no one on the outside could sense. Earlier that evening, neighbors recalled faint sounds. Nothing loud, nothing alarming, just muffled movements from the third-floor flat where 25-year-old actress Jiah Khan lived. She had been withdrawn for days. Phone calls ignored. Messages left unseen. A heaviness hung over her, though no one knew just how deep her turmoil went. Around 10:30 p.m., Jiah returned home after stepping out briefly. CCTV had captured some movements earlier, but strangely, several clips from around that time would later be reported missing or incomplete, an early red flag that would haunt the investigation for years. Inside her apartment, everything appeared undisturbed. The lights were dim. Her belongings were lying where they usually did. Nothing signaled what was about to come. At roughly 11 p.m., her mother, Rabiya, entered the flat. The door wasn't locked. The silence inside felt thick, unnatural. She called out to Jiah once, then twice, no answer. Something in the stillness pushed her toward the bedroom. And there, the world changed. She saw her daughter hanging from the ceiling fan with a dupatta, still, silent, and impossibly pale. A scream shattered the quiet. Neighbors rushed in. Panic spread through the hallway. Someone called for help. Someone tried lowering the body. Someone froze in shock. Details from these chaotic minutes would later conflict. Who cut the dupatta? Who touched the body? Who made the first phone call? These inconsistencies would later become part of the long list of unanswered questions. Police arrived shortly after midnight. Within minutes, without sealed evidence, without a deep inspection, without waiting for forensic teams, an officer spoke the words that shaped the next decade. It's suicide. But even in that moment, nothing about the scene was clear, simple, or certain. Not the position of the body, not the material used, not the marks that appeared on her skin, not the timeline that would later break into pieces. The night of June 3rd didn't give answers. It only opened the door to a mystery filled with contradictions. When investigators began digging into Jiah's final weeks, one thing became unmistakably clear. Her relationship had become the center of her emotional world, and possibly the storm that pulled her under. Friends, family, and private messages painted a picture far different from the glamorous public image everyone thought they knew. Beneath the surface was a relationship marked by intensity, arguments, emotional dependence, and a disturbing pattern of fear and distress. Text messages recovered from her phone revealed repeated cycles of breakups and reunions. Late-night arguments. Long, emotional voice notes. Pleas for attention. Moments of affection quickly turning into accusations and tears. Some messages suggested she felt abandoned. Others suggested she felt controlled. And some hinted at deeper trauma, the kind that leaves invisible bruises long before anything physical appears. In the weeks before her death, Jiah allegedly confided in close friends that she felt trapped, misunderstood, unstable. There were claims of emotional manipulation, threats, apologies, and promises that were never kept. Investigators also uncovered evidence pointing toward a pregnancy scare, a discovery that added fuel to the emotional fire. Reports suggested medical procedures, intense arguments, and a wave of fear that swept through her life during those days. Her emotional state, according to those close to her, was fragile, but her determination to be loved and acknowledged was strong. The relationship wasn't simply romantic. It was volatile, consuming, and increasingly dark. Family members said Jiah was becoming a different person, quieter, more anxious, easily triggered. She lived in her thoughts, and those thoughts seemed to revolve around one individual, one bond that she desperately hoped would stabilize, even as it seemed to be pulling her deeper into chaos. Days before her death, neighbors recalled muffled crying. A friend mentioned receiving troubling messages from her late at night, and her mother noticed a heaviness in her eyes, the kind of sadness that doesn't come from a single moment, but from weeks of emotional exhaustion. What investigators found wasn't a simple love story. It was a tangled web of passion, power, fear, and dependency. A relationship that may have held answers, or may have added even more questions to a case already drowning in contradictions. A few days after Jiah's death, a discovery inside her home shifted the entire direction of the investigation. A handwritten note that would become the most debated piece of evidence in the entire case. The note wasn't found on the night of her death. It wasn't found by police. It wasn't logged as early evidence. It surfaced later, handed over by her family, who said they discovered it among her belongings. Immediately, questions erupted. The letter was emotional, detailed, and filled with accusations, heartbreak, betrayal, pain, and memories that painted a picture of a young woman spiraling. But investigators and forensic experts quickly noticed something unusual. Was it truly written as a suicide note, or was it a personal letter never meant to be found this way? The handwriting analysis turned into a battleground. Some experts claimed it matched her handwriting. Others argued parts of it looked different, as if written at different times, in different emotional states, or even under pressure. Even more suspicious were the missing pages. Some sections seemed incomplete. Some lines ended abruptly. Some paragraphs hinted at events with no follow-up. A note this emotional should have offered clarity. Instead, it added layers of ambiguity. The contents were heavy, descriptions of emotional hurt, allegations of control, references to trauma, and reflections on a relationship that appeared to deteriorate rapidly. The tone fluctuated between heartbreak and accusation, between vulnerability and frustration. But there was something even more troubling. Why wasn't the note found by police? Why did it appear later? And why did it instantly become the centerpiece of the case? Critics argued that the timing of its discovery compromised its authenticity. Supporters believed it was Jiah's final attempt to explain her pain. Every emotionally charged sentence became a point of debate. Every accusation became a headline. Every reference in the letter became a potential clue to whether her death was self-inflicted or the result of something far more sinister. What should have been the clearest piece of evidence became one of the most controversial. Instead of solving the mystery, the suicide note deepened it, blurring the line between a personal confession and a potential clue to a crime. If the emotional note raised eyebrows, the forensic findings detonated them. This wasn't just a case of unclear evidence. It was a case where the science itself refused to agree with the initial conclusion of suicide. When forensic experts examined Jiah's body, several inconsistencies immediately surfaced, and each one chipped away at the simplicity of the suicide narrative. One of the first red flags was the nature of the ligature marks around her neck. Experts noted that the marks did not entirely match the pattern expected from a soft material like a Jiah. Some claimed the depth, angle, and position were inconsistent with a typical self-hanging scenario. Others suggested the marks were lower and more horizontal than expected, a possible indicator of manual pressure or different type of ligature. This single detail became one of the most fiercely debated points in the case. Another major question: could Jiah have reached the fan easily and tied the Jiah securely? The height of the fan, her own height, and the lack of supporting furniture nearby raised doubts. Measurements were inconsistent. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts. The position of the furniture didn't conclusively prove how the act was carried out. Some experts argued she could have done it. Others insisted the setup was physically impractical without assistance. In cases of hanging, certain injuries are commonly observed on the neck, chin, and sometimes the tongue due to pressure and suspension. Some of these were missing. Some appeared faint. Others appeared inconsistent with a vertical drop. Again, the science contradicted itself. Some reports said the body showed signs of partial suspension. Others suggested the compression didn't match that theory at all. The japata, the very item said to have ended her life, had its own problems. Forensic labs examined the strength of the material, the shape of the knot, and whether the fabric could withstand the force of body weight. Some said yes. Others argued the material was too flimsy to handle prolonged suspension. The knot itself was a point of suspicion. Was it tied by someone who knew how to tie stable knots? Or by someone attempting it under emotional distress? Or was it tied after the fact? No conclusion ever fit perfectly. Some forensic observers pointed out markings on the body that could indicate a struggle or secondary movement before suspension. Others dismissed them as post-mortem artifacts. The forensic world couldn't agree, and in a case like this, disagreement only deepened the shadows. Instead of offering clarity, the forensic examination fractured the investigation into conflicting opinions. Times some experts insisted suicide. Times others argued homicide. Times and many believed the evidence had been compromised from the moment the body was touched that night. The truth, somewhere between the science and the silence, remained elusive. The more the case leaned on forensics, the more it revealed how fragile the investigation truly was. While the forensic reports sowed confusion, one voice remained steadfast, unwavering, and insistent: Jiah's mother, Rabiya Khan. From the very first moments after discovering her daughter, Rabiya refused to accept the narrative presented by the police. She believed, with every fiber of her being, that this was not suicide. Rabiya didn't just grieve, she investigated. She examined the apartment, questioned timelines, and noted inconsistencies in police statements. Every unexplained mark, every missing piece of evidence, every procedural lapse became part of a growing conviction that her daughter's death was homicide. She reached out to private forensic experts, both in India and abroad. They re-examined photographs, body positions, the ligature marks, and the suicide note. Their analyses raised alarming questions. Times could the positioning of the body have been staged? Times were some injuries deliberately overlooked or misinterpreted? Times was the note authentic, or could it have been manipulated? Rabiya meticulously documented everything. She became the primary advocate for revisiting the investigation, challenging authorities, and ensuring no detail was ignored. Her struggle was not only against grief and confusion, but also against systemic delays. Initial police investigations were deemed insufficient. Key pieces of evidence had gone missing. CCTV footage was incomplete or unavailable. Witnesses' statements were inconsistent. Rabiya persisted, filing complaints and pushing for a Central Bureau of Investigation (CBI) takeover. Her persistence kept the case alive in courts, in the media, and in public consciousness. Some critics argued that Rabiya's determination blurred objectivity with emotion. But the unresolved discrepancies she highlighted, fan height, body marks, timeline gaps, deleted phone messages, were undeniable. She also highlighted the behavior of her daughter's partner, raising questions about motives, manipulation, and responsibility. Rabiya became the face of a mother's fight for truth, a constant reminder to investigators, lawyers, and the public that the case was not closed, even if authorities wanted it to be. For more than a decade, Rabiya's efforts ensured that Jiah Khan's death remained in the spotlight. Her relentless pursuit of answers forced forensic reviews, legal battles, and media scrutiny. And in the process, she transformed the tragedy from a private sorrow into a public quest for justice, one filled with unanswered questions, contradictions, and moral dilemmas. Jiah's death, Rabiya argued, was too complex, too suspicious, too inconsistent to be accepted at face value. From the very beginning, the handling of Jiah Khan's case by Mumbai police raised eyebrows. What should have been a meticulous investigation was riddled with procedural lapses, missing evidence, and rushed conclusions, creating a storm that would persist for years. Within hours of discovering the body, police reportedly labeled the death as suicide. While initial appearances suggested self-hanging, officers did not secure the apartment properly, nor did they conduct a detailed, immediate forensic assessment. Times the Japata was touched by multiple people. Times furniture was moved. Times initial photographs lacked critical angles. By the time official documentation was completed, potential evidence had been altered or lost. Witnesses, neighbors, friends, and family members provided conflicting accounts. Times who first entered the room, times who called the police, times who moved the body. Investigators recorded statements, but contradictions were either overlooked or poorly reconciled. This left gaps in the timeline that would haunt the case later. Several key elements were reportedly missing from the initial investigation. Times CCTV footage from surrounding buildings. Times phone call records and deleted messages. Times early forensic reports on ligature marks and body positioning. The absence of these crucial pieces raised suspicions of either negligence or deeper obfuscation. Police communication with Jiah's family was inconsistent. Rabiya Khan repeatedly complained about a lack of transparency and delayed updates. Investigators claimed routine procedure. The family saw disregard and inefficiency, which fueled media speculation and public distrust. Within hours, the case became sensationalized. News channels broadcasted dramatic narratives, often quoting incomplete or unverified statements. Some argued this influenced police reporting, pushing the narrative towards suicide and silencing alternative theories. By the time the investigation reached forensic experts, lawyers, and the family, the initial mishandling had already created a maze of inconsistencies. Times early conclusions clashed with forensic evidence. Times witness accounts contradicted each other. Times key evidence was missing. The police investigation, meant to provide clarity, instead fueled uncertainty, leaving the case vulnerable to decades of debate, legal battles, and public scrutiny. As the controversy around Jiah Khan's death grew, the limitations of the Mumbai police investigation became impossible to ignore. Pressure from the family, media, and public opinion led to a Central Bureau of Investigation, CBI, takeover, a movement to bring impartiality, rigor, and credibility to the case. Rabiya Khan had repeatedly raised concerns. Times mishandling of the crime scene. Times missing CCTV footage. Times contradictory witness statements. Times incomplete forensic reports. The Supreme Court intervened, ordering the CBI to investigate. The aim was clear: to determine whether Jiah's death was suicide or homicide, and to uncover evidence overlooked or ignored by the local police. Upon taking over, CBI officers meticulously retraced the steps of the initial investigation. Times photographs of the room were analyzed anew. Times interviews with family, friends, and neighbors were conducted in detail. Times phone records, deleted messages, and digital footprints were examined. Several findings contradicted the original suicide narrative. Times timeline gaps that the police had missed. Times discrepancies in the ligature marks versus the fan's height. Times conflicting statements from witnesses. The CBI also questioned Jiah's partner, Sooraj Pancholi, and closely examined his role in her final days. The CBI highlighted multiple areas where the initial investigation appeared flawed. Times lack of proper crime scene preservation. Times insufficient forensic analysis. Times over-reliance on circumstantial evidence. Times missing early documentation of critical items. These conflicts added credibility to Rabiya Khan's allegations and cast doubt on the conclusion of suicide. Deleted messages and missing phone data were key to the investigation. The CBI tried to reconstruct conversations and timelines, but some data appeared irretrievably lost. Critical WhatsApp messages, call logs, and social media activity had vanished or been altered, a problem that would later become a major point of contention in court. Despite the CBI's involvement, questions remained. Times could all evidence be recovered after initial mishandling? Times were there deliberate attempts to erase or manipulate data? Times was this a tragic suicide, or had something more sinister taken place? The case had entered a new phase, one that would extend for a decade, fueled by legal battles, forensic disputes, and public scrutiny. The CBI's involvement promised clarity, but in reality, it only deepened the mystery, leaving the ultimate truth just out of reach. The death of Jiah Khan did not end with her passing. Instead, it transformed into a decade-long legal saga, where the courtroom became the battlefield for truth, suspicion, and justice. In 2013, Sooraj Pancholi, Jiah's boyfriend, was arrested by the CBI under charges of abetment to suicide. The allegation was that his actions, emotional abuse, threats, and pressure had directly contributed to her death. However, Pancholi consistently denied wrongdoing. His defense argued, times Jiah was independent and emotionally unstable. Times there was no direct evidence linking him to her death. Times the case was built on circumstantial evidence and public pressure. Over the years, multiple witnesses testified. Times friends recounted emotional conflicts and arguments. Times neighbors provided observations about the night of her death. Times family members described patterns of distress and alleged abuse. But contradictions were common. Statements often conflicted with earlier reports, the suicide note, or forensic findings, giving the defense material to challenge the prosecution at every step. Courts saw repeated arguments from forensic experts. Times was the ligature mark consistent with hanging? Times could the fan's height allow a self-inflicted act? Times were injuries consistent with a struggle or staged scene? Experts disagreed, creating doubt in the minds of judges and jurors alike. These debates extended the case and made the verdict far from straightforward. The case faced multiple delays. Times change of investigating officers. Times re-examination of evidence. Times media sensationalism influencing perceptions. Times requests for additional forensic analysis. Each delay prolonged uncertainty, testing the patience of Jiah's family and the public's trust in the justice system. From the beginning, media attention was relentless. Newspapers, television channels, and social media debates created public narratives that influenced perceptions, sometimes overshadowing facts. The courtroom became a stage not just for legal arguments, but for public opinion, speculation, and scrutiny, a pressure cooker for all involved. Throughout the decade, every hearing was a reminder of Jiah's lost life and the anguish of those left behind. Her mother, Rabiya Khan, attended almost every session, challenging evidence, questioning witnesses, and demanding justice. Despite the legal back and forth, one truth remained undeniable. The case had left scars far beyond the courtroom, on family, friends, and the nation's conscience. The death of Jiah Khan did not end with her passing. Instead, it transformed into a decade-long legal saga, where the courtroom became the battlefield for truth, suspicion, and justice. In 2013, Sooraj Pancholi, Jiah's boyfriend, was arrested by the CBI under charges of abetment to suicide. The allegation was that his actions, emotional abuse, threats, and pressure had directly contributed to her death. However, Pancholi consistently denied wrongdoing. His defense argued, times Jiah was independent and emotionally unstable. Times there was no direct evidence linking him to her death. Times the case was built on circumstantial evidence and public pressure. Over the years, multiple witnesses testified. Times friends recounted emotional conflicts and arguments. Times neighbors provided observations about the night of her death. Times family members described patterns of distress and alleged abuse. But contradictions were common. Statements often conflicted with earlier reports, the suicide note, or forensic findings, giving the defense material to challenge the prosecution at every step. Courts saw repeated arguments from forensic experts. Times was the ligature mark consistent with hanging? Times could the fan's height allow a self-inflicted act? Times were injuries consistent with a struggle or staged scene? Experts disagreed, creating doubt in the minds of judges and jurors alike. These debates extended the case and made the verdict far from straightforward. The case faced multiple delays. Times change of investigating officers. Times re-examination of evidence. Times media sensationalism influencing perceptions. Times requests for additional forensic analysis. Each delay prolonged uncertainty, testing the patience of Jiah's family and the public's trust in the justice system. From the beginning, media attention was relentless. Newspapers, television channels, and social media debates created public narratives that influenced perceptions, sometimes overshadowing facts. The courtroom became a stage not just for legal arguments, but for public opinion, speculation, and scrutiny, a pressure cooker for all involved. Throughout the decade, every hearing was a reminder of Jiah's lost life and the anguish of those left behind. Her mother, Rabiya Khan, attended almost every session, challenging evidence, questioning witnesses, and demanding justice. Despite the legal back and forth, one truth remained undeniable. The case had left scars far beyond the courtroom, on family, friends, and the nation's conscience. Chapter 10. Verdict and Unanswered Questions. After a decade of legal battles, forensic debates, and emotional turmoil, the final chapter of Jiah Khan's case came with the 2023 verdict. In the end, Sooraj Pancholi was acquitted. The court cited lack of conclusive evidence to prove abetment to suicide beyond reasonable doubt. The prosecution's arguments, based heavily on circumstantial evidence, were deemed insufficient. Times contradictory witness statements. Times missing or incomplete forensic evidence. Times ambiguities in the suicide note. All contributed to a ruling that left many feeling justice had not been fully served. The judgment emphasized Times investigations had gaps, which weakened the case. Times scientific evidence was inconclusive or disputed. Times emotional testimonies, while powerful, could not replace tangible proof. The verdict was legally sound, yet emotionally unsatisfying for those who believed something darker had occurred. Even after the court's decision, mysteries linger. Times was the death truly a suicide? Times if not, who might have been responsible? Times why were critical pieces of evidence missing or mishandled? Times could the digital footprint, CCTV, and phone data have told a different story? Times did systemic failures in the initial investigation prevent the truth from emerging? Each unanswered question leaves a shadow over what should have been closure. Jiah Khan's death remains one of Bollywood's darkest mysteries, a cautionary tale about love, pressure, and the fragility of life. For her mother, Rabiya Khan, the quest for truth continues in memory and advocacy. For the public, it serves as a reminder that justice and truth are not always the same, and some mysteries remain unsolved, even when a verdict is delivered. The case, with its layers of emotion, forensic ambiguity, and courtroom drama, continues to haunt hearts and minds, leaving the world to wonder. Suicide or homicide? The truth may never fully be known. The story of Jiah Khan is not just a headline or courtroom case. It is a haunting journey into love, loss, and unanswered questions. A young life, full of promise, was cut short, leaving a mother grieving, a nation shocked, and a decade of investigation, debate, and speculation in its wake. We may never know the full truth. The evidence is fragmented, the testimonies conflicting, and the unanswered questions linger like shadows in a dimly lit room. But one thing remains undeniable. Jiah Khan's story is a reminder of the fragility of life, the weight of emotional turmoil, and the importance of seeking justice even when the path is long and uncertain. Her death challenges us to look deeper, question louder, and never accept simple answers for complex tragedies. In the end, we are left with her memory, her story, and the chilling silence of a mystery that refuses to die.